Hello and welcome to the JSA studio. I'm your host, as always, Nathan, and today we are going to be talking about Jim Harbaugh's potential suspension, as well as giving you my preseason top 25. Let's go ahead and jump right into it with Jim Harbaugh's suspension. So the news broke on Tuesday that Jim Harbaugh is potentially going to be suspended for the first 4 games of the season. According to the Detroit News, it is going to be a game-only suspension, meaning he will still be able to recruit, he will still be able to coach during the week, he will still be able to lead practices and help game plans. He just can't actually be on the field during the games. Jim Harbaugh himself is facing 1 level 1 violation, and other coaches are facing, I believe, 4 level 2 violations. And the 4 level 2 violations aren't really anything to be concerned about. They're somewhat nothing as far as I'm concerned. You might see another coach suspended or 2. I think that's highly unlikely. I don't really know what the penalty for a level 2 violation would be, but a lot of it was just, they had an analyst at practice, and you're not allowed to do that. And they were Zooming recruits and watching them work out, which is also something that they weren't allowed to do. All of these took place back in 2021. But the main level 1 violation is allegedly Jim Harbaugh bought 2 recruits that were already committed to the University of Michigan, which is an important detail, lunch at an Ann Arbor restaurant when they showed up unprompted on an unofficial visit, which that in of itself likely wouldn't have been that big of a deal. And I haven't found any real solid sources on this, but I have seen it on Twitter and a couple of other places where when they asked Jim Harbaugh about that day and they asked who paid, Jim Harbaugh reportedly said, "I don't remember who paid." Again, I can't find like an actual substantiation of that. Every article that I've read about it hasn't said that that's what happened, but I've seen it on Twitter from some reputable sources. So for now, I'm going to run with the assumption that that is the interaction. That's how it went. Jim Harbaugh simply said that I don't remember who paid. If it comes out later that that is not how the conversation went, then I will probably address it. But for now, with all of the information that I have at hand, that is how I'm going to assume it went. And if that is the case, then I completely understand why Jim Harbaugh would not be willing to admit that he lied to investigators, because there is absolutely no way to prove that Jim Harbaugh actually knew or remembered who paid on that day unless they find like emails about him trying to cover it up or whatever, which if something like that did occur, there is a 0% chance that it wouldn't be leaked out already. So given that that hasn't happened, I don't think we're looking at like a grand conspiracy here. I think it's largely comes down to Jim Harbaugh is a very disagreeable individual and does not like the NCAA very much. So we're going to pivot here a little bit from just sort of laying out the facts and maybe some context for what I'm going to say right now. Now, this is all just my opinion until we talk about the top 25. I've seen some people talk about how Michigan is being unfairly targeted with a lot of these allegations and investigations and the penalties and all of that. And there people are citing Tennessee, who had like 800 violations or 300 violations or something like that, and basically just got a slap on the wrist. Well, Tennessee fired their head coach, so that's punishment enough. He is now a high school PE coach, or teacher, rather. That's punishment enough for him. If Jeremy Pruitt was still there, he probably would have been suspended for like a full year with 800 recruiting violations. But he isn't there anymore because Tennessee fired him. So I don't think that's a 1-to-1 comparison. Now, I do think there is a double standard at play, or at least perhaps a vindictive or revenge-based punishment in play here. I just don't think it's because it's the University of Michigan. I think it's because it's Jim Harbaugh. I mean, basically every year since he came back to college football in 2015, Jim Harbaugh has gotten into a fight with the NCAA. At first it was satellite camps. Then it was the trips that he was taking the kids on when they went to Italy and South Africa. And I think they went to South Africa. I think they went to France too. He's taking them on all these trips. And the NCAA didn't like that very much. And then it was the transfer portal, where he was talking about how they need to adopt a one-time free transfer sort of situation. They now have adopted, but they didn't like that very much. So I firmly believe that if this was any other coach in the country other than Jim Harbaugh, they're probably not getting suspended for 4 games unless they actually come out and prove that there was some sort of cover up, which, if that was the case, I think we would have gotten pieces of it at least by now. I don't think that there is any scenario where that shit isn't leaked out by now. I mean, these allegations came down in like January. It's been 6 months, it's been half a year. We would have gotten something leaked out that if there was a sort of cover up of like grand proportions, a big conspiracy to conceal and cover up this stuff. I just don't believe that's the case. Do I think it's possible that Jim Harbaugh lied to NCAA investigators, or perhaps was very uncooperative when they asked to do some investigations or stuff like that? Yes, I think I don't think it's possible. I think it's probable. I think it's more likely than not that Jim Harbaugh was not very cooperative with this investigation. And the amount of times he's gotten in fights with the NCAA and how just absolutely garbage of an organization the NCAA is, I don't blame him for that. But I do understand, and if I'm being honest, agree with the NCAA bringing down the hammer on coaches buying things for players. I do understand and somewhat agree with why the penalty has to be harsher than the crime. It's sort of like the NFL with players gambling on NFL games or college football games, or really just gambling in general. I understand why they have to have the penalties be so harsh, because if they aren't, then people will either make calculated risks or potentially just get away with it entirely. So even though it was probably just a meal, which for 2 kids was probably like $50, maybe a little bit less, maybe a little bit more, who knows? I don't think that's that big of a deal, but I understand from an organizational standpoint why the NCAA has to be harsher on those things than maybe a rational, fair assessment would deem, because the penalty has to be so much worse than the crime to just ensure that it is a big enough deterrent that nobody is ever going to do it. However, now with NIL, you just have all these colleges nowadays just paying kids to come commit and play for their team anyway. So it is very hypocritical to say, well, we can't buy a kid a lunch, but a big time booster can buy that kid a Lamborghini and nobody gives a fuck. But again, it wasn't even about that. It wasn't even about Jim Harbaugh buying the kids the lunch, really. It was about him allegedly lying to investigators. And if it comes out that it is true that Jim Harbaugh just said, I don't remember who paid for it, then there is no legal way for this suspension to be enacted. Like, I think Jim Harbaugh, if that is the facts of the case, where the NCAA is cracking down on him and suspending him and going after him because he said he didn't remember buying a kid a lunch from a year ago when it wasn't like a scheduled thing that was happening, then Jim Harbaugh has a hell of a court case to be able to go to court and say that this is retaliatory for comments that he's made in the past, or perhaps a malicious punishment. Now, in reality, I do think it's probably more than that, because if that was the case, then you would already probably see Jim Harbaugh launching a countersuit and trying to get the sentence overturned. So I think it's probably somewhere in the middle. I don't think it's impossible that Jim Harbaugh, for example, perhaps refused to hand over accounts from his like business card or anything that he would have expensed out as something for the University of Michigan to reimburse him for, which is probably what happens. A lot of the cases, like I imagine the University of Michigan might reimburse him for traveling somewhere to go see a recruit or something like that. I'd be surprised if he was paying for that out of pocket. So if he refused to hand over that type of information, which is information that they do have the legal right to ask for, since it's directly related to work, and if Jim Harbaugh refused to hand that over, then they could say that you are not being compliant and punish him for that. That would all be within the realms of acceptable sort of standards, which I would not be surprised if that happened. But if they were asking for his personal accounts, like his personal credit card, or to see if he wrote a check for cash that day so that he could buy lunch for them or something like that, his personal, like even if it was a business that he owns, or like his checkbook information, they can't ask for that. That is not something that they can ask for, but they can ask for something related to his actual job. So if he had expensed out that meal or something like that, which would be extraordinarily stupid to do, and I doubt that he did, then they would have caught him red-handed with it. But given that that isn't the case, that they're not punishing him for buying the actual meal, that they're punishing him for lying about it, I think it's probably what I said in the middle, where Jim Harbaugh either refused or was real uncooperative in terms of like handing over what the NCAA was asking for while they were doing their investigations. I think that is likely what he is actually being punished for, and I don't think another coach in the country probably would have gotten the hammer brought down on them as hard as Jim Harbaugh has gotten the hammer brought down on him. Now, all that being said, I think Jim Harbaugh comes out looking fantastic from this whole ordeal. I mean, the NCAA is like college football fans treat the NCAA like communists treat Amazon. Like this, the culmination of all that is evil in the world. So Jim Harbaugh fighting against the NCAA is only going to make him look good and earn public affection. Like when it was first reported that Jim Harbaugh was getting investigated for buying recruits a hamburger meal, even like Ohio State and Michigan State fans were just like, this is fucking ridiculous. That if this is the case and it is true that that's what he's being investigated for, then that's fucking ridiculous. And I think he's going to come out looking better for fighting this than if he had just sort of cooperated and done everything that the NCAA had asked. That's my assessment of the Jim Harbaugh suspension and the whole allegations that are being levied at him. Obviously, you're going to see people from other fan bases just talk shit about Jim Harbaugh now, saying that he's like buying recruits stuff, but that's because they're fucking morons. And I don't pay attention or listen to them. So now that that's done, let's go ahead and get into what I wanted this video to be, which is talking about where I'm going to rank Michigan in my top 25. So before we get into the actual top 25 rankings, I'm just going to real quickly go and talk about some of the teams that just missed my top 25, and that is Iowa, Ole Miss, Tulane, Kentucky, and Maryland. I think Iowa and Maryland have a very good chance of being ranked in the actual AP top 25. I think Maryland is a program to buy stock in, because once the Big Ten in 2024 switches to that new scheduling where if you're bad teams, you're going to play bad teams, and if you're good, then you're going to play good teams sort of scheduling, I think they're going to be much better in that situation. Kentucky, I just have a lot of questions about the quarterback play, but I do like Stoops. I do like Coach Stoops. I think he's a very, very good football coach and has put together a consistent program with Kentucky. Tulane, they ended up beating USC last year, which was crazy to watch, but they did lose some talent, and I'm not sure if they can reload quite yet. Ole Miss, I just have major questions about that whole team. I think Lane Kiffin is a good football coach, but I don't know if they have a quarterback. I don't think Spencer Sanders is great. I think Jackson Dart has a lot of talent, but I don't know if he's actually going to play because Spencer Sanders is there. So I don't know about Ole Miss. I've just got too many question marks with that team right now. And Iowa, I'm just not sure that team is going to be good enough to be ranked, really. I have a lot of questions about that team, and most of it stems from the offensive coordinator. What is it, Brian Ferentz? I think it's Brian Ferentz, and Kurt Ferentz is the head coach. If I've got that flipped, I apologize. But those are my just misses. So I actually think it's more interesting to start at number one and work your way backwards rather than starting at like 25 through 20 and then talking about them, because we all know who's going to be ranked at that point. So I think it's a little bit more interesting to see who sneaks in at the back end than versus the teams that we know are going to be ranked up top. And number one is Georgia, and it isn't close. It's not a discussion that can be had. They are number one. They are likely going to remain as the number one team in the country for the next 2 or 3 years in the preseason polls because they are still recruiting at a ridiculously high level. Like, they're pulling off what Clemson and Alabama were doing, but better because Clemson and Alabama still had to compete with each other, and Georgia isn't competing with anybody at that level right now. Worst case scenario, they have a top 10 defense and a top 3 offensive line and some very talented running backs, some very talented receivers, and the quarterback position is probably going to be okay. I understand that there's a new offensive coordinator, which is somewhat concerning. I think Todd Monken is a very, very good play caller, but I'm not all that concerned because Georgia is a premier job, so they've probably got somebody that can call plays. But, this is kind of what I meant. Georgia's not very interesting to talk about because we already know how good Georgia is going to be. Number 2 for me is LSU, and that's maybe a little bit shocking to some people. I think there's a decent chance that Michigan actually ends up as number 2 in the preseason AP poll. I wouldn't consider it a great chance by any means. I think it's more than likely going to be Ohio State at 2 and Michigan at 3. But I just like this LSU team. I am so high on this LSU team. I think they're probably, in my mind, are the team most likely to win the national title. I don't think Georgia's going to three-peat because I don't think that's ever happened in college football, or at least not in post 1950s college football. So I'm going to roll with LSU here at number 2 and as my preseason favorites to win the national championship. I think Jaden Daniels is a Heisman contender. I think Malik Neighbors is likely a first-round pick. Harold Perkins might be the best football player in the country regardless of position. And they've got a whole bunch of talent. When you combine transfer portal and regular recruiting rankings, I think they're number 2 in that, and they're returning most of their production on offense and defense. I think Brian Kelly is a top 7 at worst head coach in college football, and I think he's proven himself to be that. I think Notre Dame held him back, if I'm being entirely honest with you, and I do think he will, maybe if it's not this year, but in the future, I think he will get a national title with LSU. Each of the past 3 head coaches there have won a national title. They just haven't been able to consistently be at that level. And I don't know if Brian Kelly is going to be able to do that either, but he dramatically overperformed in year 1, and in year 2, I am fully on board the LSU hype train. At number 3, I've got Ohio State. They are the most talented team in the country. They have maybe the best defensive player in college football in Tommy Eichenberg, and maybe the best offensive player in football in Marvin Harrison Jr. Now, Tommy Eichenberg is probably a top 5 defensive player in college football for me. Harold Perkins is probably number 1, but Tommy Eichenberg might damn well be number 2, and you can make an argument for him to be number 1. If you actually watch this guy on film, he's fucking phenomenal. And I know what you're going to say. Oh, they have a first-year quarterback. You can't put them ahead of Michigan. Michigan has, no question marks on their entire team except for maybe corner 2. And you're right. But Ohio State doesn't have a question mark at quarterback either. Every quarterback that has played at Ohio State in my lifetime has been better than the best quarterback in the history of Michigan football. And Kyle McCord is not going to change that reality. He's going to come out, he's going to throw for 3,500 yards and somewhere between 32 and 40 touchdowns. That's just what's going to happen. Now, that doesn't mean that I don't think Michigan can beat Ohio State, because they can't. That doesn't mean that I don't think Michigan will be ranked higher than Ohio State in the actual AP poll. I'm just giving you my honest opinion. I think Ohio State is the most talented team in the country right now. I think it's close. Georgia, LSU, who are ranked ahead of them because Georgia won the last 2 national titles, and I think LSU has a better quarterback and similar levels of wide receiver talent. But I don't have a whole lot of question marks about this Ohio State team either. I think even if Ohio State has the worst quarterback they've had of my lifetime in Kyle McCord, or whoever the hell else. Maybe Kyle McCord sucks so bad they have to go to the backup quarterback. I don't know. Even if that is the case, they have maybe the best running back in all of college football in Mayan Williams. And Travion Henderson is an excellent compliment for him. Now, I think Mayan Williams is probably 3 on my list in terms of best running backs in the country. Number 1 would be Rocket Sanders. Number 2 would be Blake Corum. But Mayan Williams is right there. He is phenomenal. If he was healthy, I'm not sure Michigan beats Ohio State this past year. That is how good I think he is. So if he could stay healthy, this is going to be a different Ohio State team. And if Kyle McCord is a bad quarterback by Ohio State standards, they have enough talent in the running back and at the wide receiver position to where it might not even matter if the quarterback is subpar. So I don't have a whole lot of question marks about this team. I think the defense, which, by the way, last year they finished as a top 15 defense in the country, and I think they're going to get better this year because their main weakness was at the cornerback position and in the secondary. And even though they didn't particularly address the safety position and they lost their best player there in Ronnie Hickman, they did get better at the cornerback position by bringing in that Ole Miss transfer whose name is escaping me at the moment, who I think has the potential to be a first-round corner. And I think his presence takes a lot of the pressure off of Denzel Burke, who's also extraordinarily talented, and it takes a lot of pressure off of the guys in the slot and just makes that whole secondary better. And their front seven, you can put up against any front seven in college football, and you could not make a definitive statement that any front seven in college football is better than Ohio State's front seven. So I think the defense has a serious chance to be top 10 this year, and legitimately top 10, and the offense is going to do what the offense always does and be extraordinarily productive. Okay, so I've got Michigan at 4. I am not someone who is married to their preseason rankings. They will change dramatically after week 1, probably not after week 0, but week 1 they will probably change dramatically as I get to watch these teams and kind of figure out if they're for real or not. And one of the biggest things with Michigan is, can J.J. McCarthy take the step forward in the passing game? I'm not sure he can, but if he does, then this is maybe the number 1 team in the country. If he can be a, 3,000 yards, 25 to 28 touchdowns kind of guy, he's probably not going to get more than that. But like when Michigan has to throw the ball, like if they're playing against Maryland and they get in a shootout and J.J. McCarthy has to sling it a little bit, and he goes for like 350 and 4 touchdowns with maybe an interception or maybe not. If he does that, then I could definitely see Michigan as the number 1 team in the country for me. Because if they add a dynamic and potentially consistent passing game threat, then the running game is going to be able to do whatever the fuck it wants, and the offensive line is going to be able to dominate every single game. I think this is the best Michigan offensive line, maybe since the year I was born in 1997. And Blake Corum this year has the chance to solidify himself as the best running back in the history of Michigan football, or at least the modern history of Michigan football. Not to mention the best backup running back in all of college football in Donovan Edwards, and some very talented backs behind him. So this is the best running back room in the country, very likely. The best offensive line in the country, pretty clearly. A defensive line that goes 8, 9, maybe 10 deep. A underrated linebacking core and an elite secondary. So the defense is going to be, I think, much better than last year, mainly because I believe they will actually be able to rush the passer, which is not something that they could do last year. I think this is a better all-around team than the 2022 Michigan Wolverines. If J.J. McCarthy can take that step forward and become a legitimate high-level college quarterback, which a lot of people are very confident that he's going to do that. Maybe it's because I am such a big fan of Michigan and I'm just generally a pessimistic guy. I'm not as sold on that possibility as a lot of other people, but I hope he proves me wrong, and I'll be able to tell pretty early on in the season if that's going to be the case or not. But if that is the case, if he becomes not even necessarily an elite college football quarterback, but a genuinely great college football quarterback, like a top 20, top 15 quarterback in college football, then this team, even if Ohio State hits their ceiling, even if Georgia hits their ceiling, this team will be able to play and potentially beat those teams. Number 5, I have Alabama. And if you had told me 3 years ago that I would rank Michigan ahead of Alabama, not that the AP poll or that the college football playoff poll would rank Michigan ahead of Alabama, that Nathan would rank Michigan ahead of Alabama, I would not fucking believe you. But this team has a lot of question marks. I'm not sold on the offensive line outside of J.C. Latham. I'm not sold on the linebacking core. I'm not sold on the safeties. I think last year they honestly played pretty bad. I think Malachi Moore is one of the most overrated players in college football. Now, the defensive line is very, very good, and I actually think their receiving core is underrated. I actually really like a lot of the talent that they have in the receiving core. But my biggest question is the legit concern that I have about the quarterback situation for the Alabama Crimson Tide. And maybe even more concerning than that is your new play caller in Tommy Rees. Tommy Rees is not an elite play caller. He's not a very good offensive coordinator, in my opinion. I think Notre Dame is going to be way better off without him than they were with him. And I question how good the offense is going to be. I don't think this is, 2014, 2013, 2015, that sort of era where they could throw anybody out there at quarterback and the running game was so good and the defense was so dominant that they could just win the national title by doing that. I don't think that is the case anymore. I think teams are way too talented nowadays, and I think you have to be able to have an elite offense in order to win the national title or even just compete in the SEC right now. And from what I've been able to read about the quarterback situation, Jalen Milroe appears to be the front runner, but Tyler Buchner is right there and legitimately competing, as is Ty Simpson, although he is sort of considered likely a third place guy, is kind of the vibe that I have been getting from the articles that I've been reading about Alabama. Now, if Jalen Milroe is starting quarterback, I am slightly less concerned because he's going to be able to run the fucking football. So it's not that concerning if it is Jalen Milroe. But you're going to get in a position where he's going to need to throw the football, and that is concerning. He definitely has the potential to be a very, very, very good quarterback. I mean, he's an elite athlete. He's got a great arm, but I haven't seen it out of him yet. I haven't seen even the ability to just be an okay passer of the football, and with how elite he is with his feet, then if you're an okay passer, then you can win a national title pretty easily. I mean, that's basically what Jalen Hurts was when he was at Alabama, and you damn near won 2 national titles with him. What gives me pause, though, is the fact that Tyler Buchner, who was maybe the worst starting quarterback in the Power 5 that I saw last year, is, by all reports, legitimately competing to be your starting quarterback. That is so concerning. I can't even describe it. Like, when I heard that a few months ago, I was like, Alabama might fucking go 8-4. Like, this might be the year where everybody gets a piece of Alabama, like Clemson 2 years ago, and then they kind of come back when they actually get themselves a legitimate quarterback, which Aaron Noland is. He's going to be ridiculous when he gets to Alabama next offseason. We'll probably just step in and start day one. But for this year, having Tyler Buchner as either your backup quarterback or your starting quarterback is not ideal. Everything else about this team, they don't mean a whole lot. I have some questions about the secondary. Like, I don't know how good transfers Trey Amos or Jalen Key are going to be. I think they're going to be solid at least, but I don't know if they're going to be good. We have no idea how good Caleb Downs is going to be. I get that everybody is comparing him to Mika Fitzpatrick, but he's a true freshman, and we don't know. Kool-Aid McKinstry is phenomenal. Malachi Moore is what he is. He's not a liability at the very least. So I do have some questions about this team, but they honestly don't mean a whole lot if you have yourself a quarterback. And those question marks become irrelevant if you don't have a quarterback because you're not going to compete for shit. So those other question marks don't particularly matter. I think if Jalen Milroe comes out and plays phenomenally, like Bryce Young, maybe not Heisman winning caliber, but very, very good, then the question marks on the defense aren't going to mean a whole lot because he's just going to be so good you're going to win all your games anyway. And if he's really bad and Tyler Buchner is who Tyler Buchner was this past season, then your questions on defense aren't going to mean shit because your offense is going to, like, best case scenario, get you to 9-3. So I think you, more than any other team in the country, your quarterback is really going to decide how your team plays this year, how good you are, and what your ceiling is. All right, so we're going to go 5 at a time from here on out because I could probably spend 5 minutes on every team in the top 25, but this video is already over 30 minutes long. So we're going to speed things up here a little bit. I got Florida State at 6. I think they have a Heisman contender at quarterback. I think they have a legitimate national title caliber ceiling. Penn State at 7. I think the defense could be transcendent. I think Drew Allar is going to be a very, very good quarterback. But the question is, can they even get out of the Big Ten, let alone compete for the playoffs? USC, obviously the question is defense. Can your defense just be bad? If your defense could just be bad, then you have a pretty good chance to make the playoffs. But if they're a straight-up liability, then probably not. Clemson, can Cade Klubnik take the step forward and be a good quarterback? That is the question that surrounds this team. Will Shipley is going to be good. The defense is going to be fine because it always is. And you do play Florida State, likely going to play Florida State twice. I think they play week 4 or 5 and then probably in the championship game. So if you split those games, you got a pretty good chance of making the playoffs. Texas at 10. You have maybe the highest ceiling of any team not ranked in the top 5. This could be an all-time team. I think Quinn Ewers is a top 10 pick. I think you have potentially maybe the second best wide receiving core, or maybe not wide receiving, just receiving core, so it includes tight ends, in all of college football, and a defense that has a tremendous amount of talent. And I think Steve Sarkisian is a very, very good play caller. So I think this team has a legitimate national title type of ceiling. Number 11, I have Washington. I think Washington is very, very good. Like I said, with Texas, they have maybe the second best receiving core in all of college football. I think Michael Penix is a very, very good quarterback, probably a top 10 quarterback in all of college football. I do have questions about the defense, but again, if the defense can just be middle of the pack or maybe, just bad but not a straight up liability, then you have a very good chance to win the Pac-12 and potentially even make the playoffs. I've got Notre Dame at 12. I just have a lot of question marks about this team. I'm not sure if you're going to be able to run the football all that good. Like, I think you'll be effective, but I'm not sure it'll be the type of run game where you can always get yours. I think the defense is potentially going to take a step back from last year. And even though I really like Sam Hartman, I'm not sure he is good enough to get you over the bump. Utah, same sort of story. I'm not sure the offense is going to be good enough. I think the defense potentially regresses, and I don't think your quarterback is good enough to make up the difference. Tennessee at 14. This is the team that has a lot of potential. They could legitimately contend for the playoffs. I don't think they can win the national title, but they can legitimately contend for the playoffs because it really just has to have them upsetting one of either Alabama, who potentially doesn't have a quarterback, and or Georgia, who potentially is taking a step back from these past 2 years. They could legitimately compete for the playoffs. At 15, I have Wisconsin. I think Luke Fickell is an elite football coach. I think Tanner Mordecai is a good college football quarterback, and I think they're going to be able to run the ball pretty much against anybody, along with a defense that is good, maybe not great, but good. At number 16, I have Kansas State. I think they're pretty clearly the second best team in the Big 12. I really like the program that you've got going on over there right now. Number 17, I have UCLA. I think Dante Moore is going to come in year 1 and be effective. I do think you're probably taking a little bit of a step back from last year, but I still think you are a top 25 caliber team. 18, Oregon. I am just not sold on Bo Nix. I get that he played well, but there's just something about him that makes me feel like he can't win big games. And he's going to have a lot of big games this year. Maybe he proves me wrong. I hope he does. But right now, I am lower on you than most analysts are. Speaking of me being lower on a team, I got TCU at 19. I think they are maybe not necessarily going to fall off a cliff, but I don't think they're contenders in the Big 12 this year. I think they're probably still going to be solid. I think 8-4 is perhaps a realistic expectation, but I think last year was magical. Basically, I think there was a lot of games where you watched them and like destiny was on their side, and that's not going to repeat itself. At 20, I have the University of Texas San Antonio, UTSA. I think they are heading into the preseason the best group of 5 team, in my opinion. And I really like the program and how Jeff Taylor is running that program. At 21, I have Oregon State. I think you have an identity now, which is we're going to run the football and play defense, and that is a very powerful thing. Oklahoma at 22, I am not sold on you at all. I am not sold on Dylan Gabriel as a elite quarterback or even just a good quarterback, and I'm not sure Mike Venables is going to be able to get the defense to be really good. So I have a lot of questions about Oklahoma. And to be entirely honest with you, I didn't really want to rank them, but I did because I do recognize the talent level and the potential of the roster. At 23, I have UNC, North Carolina. Drake May is really, really good. I think they have the potential to maybe sneak their way into the ACC championship game, and then you never know what could happen. At 24, I have Purdue. I think they're a very solid team. I understand that I am much higher on them than most people, but I think Hudson Card is a very good quarterback, and I really like Ryan Walters as a head football coach. And at 25, we have maybe the sneakiest team in the country this year in Texas Tech. And that is all that I have for you today. Up next, we're going to go ahead and break down several college football playoff scenarios. So look forward to that. With all that being said, go ahead and like the video if you like the video. Subscribe if you want to see more content like this. And if you have anything to say, if you disagree with me at any point, go ahead and let me know in the comment section down below. But let's keep it civil. After all, what do I know? I'm just some asshole. And I'll see you next time.